The clouds over the Eastern Front in the summer of 1942 were not clouds at all. They were columns of smoke drifting across the horizon from villages burned to ash and oil depots set alight in retreat. Below them, the steppe stretched endlessly, a vast canvas of wheat fields and charred forests, and somewhere far ahead of that horizon, a young pilot named Erich Hartmann tightened his gloved hands around the control stick of a Messerschmitt Bf 109. He was 19 years old, barely months out of flight school, and about to fly his first combat mission. They called him Bubi, the little boy, a teasing nickname that clung to him in the barracks and briefing rooms because of his age and boyish face. Yet nothing about the day felt childish. The war was real now, and the enemy, no longer existed in diagrams or in the chalk sketches drawn by instructors on classroom boards. It was out there, moving, shooting, and killing, and Hartmann was expected to meet it head-on. The briefings he had attended in the preceding weeks had spoken in cold, mechanical terms. The Americans, though still new to this theater, were deploying heavy bombers in numbers that defied logic. The intelligence officers had described them clinically: B-17 flying fortresses, B-24 Liberators, machines of aluminum and steel that could fly higher than flak bursts and carry enough bombs to level an entire city district. They had mentioned their crews, 10 men in each aircraft, and the dozen or more machine guns that bristled from turrets and windows. But to Hartmann, these descriptions might as well have been myths. His training sorties had been spent, chasing nimble Soviet fighters and strafing ground columns. His opponents had been men like him, cold, hungry, and often desperate. The idea of a 4-engined aircraft the size of a locomotive, flying in disciplined formation and bristling with firepower, seemed almost absurd. That morning, as his squadron climbed into the thin blue over the Kuban bridgehead, the chatter on. The radio was light, even mocking. They had been told to expect a reconnaissance flight or perhaps a Soviet bomber run, nothing unusual for this sector. But then came the call from ground control, its tone clipped and urgent. Multiple contacts, high altitude, bearing west, altitude 8,000 meters, likely American. Hartmann felt his pulse quicken. He craned his neck against the glass canopy and saw nothing but sunlight and haze, yet the veteran pilots around him grew silent. They had heard the stories, and they knew what was coming. When the first glints appeared on the far horizon, Hartmann mistook them for a trick of the light. But as minutes passed, the dots multiplied and resolved into shapes, dozens of them, then scores, each with wings broad and steady. They flew in formation so tight and deliberate that they seemed almost a single organism, a migrating flock of metal and noise. And even from a distance, Hartmann could feel their presence. The air itself seemed to hum with their collective power. He had flown against Soviet Ilyushin bombers before, lumbering, clumsy machines that often fell apart under fire. But this was different. These were not just planes. They were flying fortresses in every sense of the word. The squadron leaders' voice cut through the radio static. "Form up, we go head on." There was no time to dwell on fear or fascination. Doctrine demanded aggression, frontal attacks, the only way to pierce the deadly umbrella of defensive fire. Hartmann pushed his throttle forward, feeling the Bf 109 surge beneath him, its Daimler-Benz engines screaming. The formation ahead grew larger, details sharpening, the twin tails of the B-24s, the distinctive dorsal turrets, the flicker of sunlight off gun barrels. Then came the first tracer rounds, streaking through the sky like fiery threads. In that moment, the distance between theory and reality collapsed. The classroom charts had not conveyed the sheer volume of defensive fire these bombers could unleash. It came not as a scattered burst, but as a wall, a continuous curtain of lead that hung in the air and dared anything to pass through. Hartmann's canopy shook with the shockwaves of near misses. The smell of cordite filled the cockpit as return fire from his wingmen traced jagged lines into the formation. And yet the bombers did not falter, even those struck by cannon shells held their course, bleeding smoke but flying on. Hartmann's first pass was a blur, a flash of gunfire, a glimpse of a waist gunner behind his window, the eerie sight of a bomber still flying, despite holes in its fuselage large enough to crawl through. He pulled up sharply, breath ragged, and looked back. The formation was still coming, unbroken, implacable. The sky behind him shimmered with parachutes and falling wreckage, but the wave itself pressed forward, indifferent to its losses. As he regrouped for another attack, Hartmann felt something unfamiliar: awe. These were not opponents who could be outflown or outgunned by skill alone. They were the embodiment of an industrial machine that seemed as vast and relentless as the sky itself. And as the horizon filled with the thunder of engines and the shadows of bomb bays opening over distant targets, the young pilot understood a truth that would haunt him for the rest of the war: that courage and training might win dogfights, but this was a battle being fought on a scale far larger than any cockpit could contain. The first months of Erich Hartmann's combat career were defined by a kind of war that bore little resemblance to the great duels he had imagined in flight school. It was not the chess match of altitude and firepower he had studied in manuals, nor the grand, cinematic battles that filled propaganda reels. It was a brutal, chaotic hunt over the endless plains of the East, low, fast, and unforgiving. Soviet aircraft rarely came in neat formations or predictable patterns. They appeared without warning, darting just above the treetops or skimming the contours of rivers to evade detection, and vanished again into clouds or smoke before a German pilot could even call out their position. For a young pilot like Hartmann, fresh from the regimented environment of training fields, this was a baptism by fire. The enemy fighters he encountered were nimble and aggressive, often inferior in speed or technology, but compensated by sheer numbers and audacity. Polikarpov I-10-16s and Yak-1s twisted through the air with reckless abandon, willing to trade altitude and energy for a fleeting shot at a Messerschmitt's vulnerable underbelly. Iltau-Sturmovik ground attack aircraft lumbered below, heavily armored and difficult to bring down without precise close-range bursts. Hartmann learned quickly that dogfighting here was less about elegant maneuvers and more about patience and discipline, striking only when the odds were overwhelming, then disappearing before the enemy could respond. His instructors had drilled into him the maxim, see, decide, attack, break. Now, every sortie etched that lesson deeper. He stalked lone Soviet aircraft like a hunter tracking prey, approaching from the blind spot of the sun or from below, closing to within a few dozen meters before firing a short, surgical burst. Recklessness was death. Most engagements ended before the enemy even knew he was there. Hartmann's early victories, the first hesitant ones that earned him his comrades' respect, came not from daring aerobatics, but from this cold, calculated approach. He had learned to make the most of his fighters' speed and climb rate, to exploit surprise, and above all, to survive. The rhythms of this war lulled him into a dangerous certainty. Even when Soviet units grew more experienced and the air battles more contested, the pattern remained familiar. Small groups of enemy aircraft, fleeting engagements, constant improvisation. The Luftwaffe's dominance over the Eastern Front's skies, though fraying at the edges, still felt secure. Hartmann's Messerschmitt was a scalpel, precise, lethal, and perfectly suited to this kind of aerial knife fight. Then came the intelligence briefings. By mid-1943, reports from the West began to circulate among Luftwaffe units. The Americans, they said, were sending their flying fortresses into German airspace, not in pairs or squadrons, but in formations that blotted out the sun. Each one was the size of a locomotive and carried 10 men, bristling with machine guns and able to fly home on two engines. They could absorb staggering amounts of damage and still reach their targets. And they did not come alone. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of these bombers moved as one, a slow, steady tide of aluminum and firepower that no individual fighter could hope to stop. Hartmann listened to these briefings with polite attention, but deep down he dismissed much of it as exaggeration. How different could they really be from the Soviet bombers he had faced? He knew how to get close, how to exploit blind spots. He had perfected the art of single-pass attacks. Surely the same principles would apply, but the older pilots spoke in different tones, not with the bravado that accompanied talk of Soviet foes, but with a sober respect. They described bomber formations that filled the sky from horizon to horizon, interlocking fields of defensive fire that could shred an attacker before he even reached firing range. They spoke of missions where dozens of fighters were thrown against a single wave, only to return with heavy losses and barely a dent in the enemy's numbers. And they spoke of something more troubling, that these bombers were not simply weapons, but the visible expression of an industrial power far beyond anything Germany could match. The contrast with his daily sorties over the Eastern Front was almost impossible to imagine. There, the enemy's strength lay in persistence and proximity. Here, it seemed, the threat came from sheer scale, from a war machine that could manufacture fleets of aircraft as casually as Germany built cars. Hartmann, still young enough to believe in the power of individual skill, found the idea unsettling. He would not face those bombers just yet. The Reich's heartland was still distant, and his place was still on the windswept plains of Russia. But the reports continued, and the stories grew more ominous. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a question began to form. A question that would define the next phase of his war. What happens when skill meets a sky full of machines that no amount of skill can stop? In the pilot lounges of Luftwaffe airfields, where cigarette smoke curled beneath low rafters and enamel mugs clinked against wooden tables, stories about the American heavy bombers grew with every retelling. For many young flyers like Erich Hartmann, these tales were their only knowledge of the B-17 and B-24 before they ever glimpsed one in the sky. Intelligence reports could offer technical specifications, altitude ceilings, bomb load, range, but those sterile figures meant little to men who measured their world in heartbeats and gunbursts. It was the stories, half whispered between sorties and repeated like folklore, that shaped their expectations and their fears. The most common of these stories concerned the bomber's durability. Pilots claimed they had seen B-17s flying home, with half a wing missing, engines trailing fire or fuselages torn open by flak, yet still lumbering westward, unshaken, toward England. Some swore they had watched a fortress stagger over the channel with its landing gear sheared off and its tail nearly severed, only to learn later that it had landed safely. Mechanics repeated accounts of bomber crews patching bullet holes the size of fists, counting hundreds of impacts on a single aircraft that had somehow stayed airborne. Whether these tales were exaggerated hardly mattered. They carried an unmistakable message. These were not machines that died easily. Other stories focused on their defenses. Veteran pilots returning from the Western Front described walls of fire erupting from bomber formations, overlapping cones of machine gun fire that could shred a fighter long before it reached firing range. Some claimed that B-17s carried so many guns they could shoot in every direction at once, that their gunners were trained to coordinate in deadly patterns, leaving no safe approach. Others spoke of mutual defense tactics, where bombers flew so tightly packed that their firing arcs merged into a continuous whirling storm of lead. The result, they said, was a sky that seemed alive with bullets, a storm through which no pilot could pass unscathed. There were even darker rumors, whispered in corners where younger pilots weren't supposed to listen. Some said the Americans had experimented with remote-controlled turrets so accurate they could pick off attackers at impossible ranges. Others claimed the bombers carried suicide gunners, men who would keep firing even as their aircraft fell apart around them, determined to take down one more enemy before they died. Whether true or not, such stories bred a wary respect among the Luftwaffe's fighter wings. This was no ordinary foe. What fascinated Hartmann most were the stories about the formations themselves. Pilots spoke of them not as individual aircraft, but as vast, coordinated organisms. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of bombers would cross the North Sea or the Alps in perfect geometric patterns, spaced and staggered with mathematical precision. They did not break formation even under attack. They flew as if bound together by invisible lines, their course unshaken by the fighters that clawed at their edges. And always, behind them, more would come. "You can shoot one down," one veteran told Hartmann, "but the sky will not look emptier when it falls." These tales created a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. For some pilots, they were a challenge, a chance to prove their skill against an opponent so formidable that even survival felt like victory. For others, they were a warning that courage and talent might not be enough. The older aces often spoke of a new kind of war, one that was not fought by individual pilots, but by factories, supply chains, and assembly lines. Each bomber shot down, they said, could be replaced by another rolling off an American production line before the wreckage even hit the ground. Hartmann listened to all of it in silence, trying to reconcile these myths with the war he knew. His enemies so far had been Soviet pilots, brave, determined, but fighting with limited resources and often outdated machines. The idea of an adversary who could throw away a fleet of bombers and replace it within weeks was almost unimaginable, yet the tone of the men who had seen them left no doubt. They spoke of the fortress, not with contempt, but with something closer to awe. By the time Hartmann's name appeared on a roster for Western deployment, he felt as if he already knew the bombers, their strengths, their terrors, their legendary resilience. But deep down, he also sensed that stories and reality were not the same. Myths had a way of growing in the telling, and when the day came that he saw the great silver formations for himself, he suspected that no tale, however dramatic, could prepare him for the truth that waited beyond the clouds. The morning air over southern Germany was sharp and thin, the kind that made the metal skin of Hartmann's Bf-109 rattle as it climbed through layers of cloud. At 20,000 feet, the landscape below was already distant, the rivers and towns reduced to thin lines and pale clusters, and the only thing that mattered was what lay ahead, an approaching enemy that none of the men in his squadron had yet seen with their own eyes. The ground controllers had warned them during the pre-dawn briefing. American bombers were inbound, not a handful, not a dozen, hundreds. The target was believed to be the industrial hub beyond Stuttgart, and Hartmann's group had been scrambled to intercept them before they reached the factories. He tried to steady his breathing as the altimeter needle crept upward. Even now, with the engine humming steadily and the oxygen mask pressing coldly against his face, he struggled to believe the scale of what they were about to face. Most of his combat career had been spent dueling Soviet fighters or ambushing lone ground attack aircraft. The notion of going up against entire flying cities of steel and fire, aircraft larger than anything he had ever shot at, still felt like something out of a story. And yet, as the radio crackled with updates from ground radar, the tension in the voices of veteran pilots told him this was no myth. For a time, the sky remained empty, a cold blue canvas dotted with thin streaks of contrails. Then, as the squadron leveled out on its intercept course, Hartmann noticed something unusual on the horizon, a faint horizontal smear of white against the distance. At first, he assumed it was a cloud bank forming, but the line was too regular, too defined. As the minutes passed, the shape began to glint, Light flashed in rhythmic bursts across its length, and a subtle tremor ran through the air, a distant rumble that his instruments barely registered, but his bones could feel. Contact 11. "O'clock high," the flight leader's voice announced calmly, but even through the clipped professionalism, Hartmann heard the edge of awe. The smear on the horizon was growing, stretching wider with each passing second. Then, without warning, the realization struck him like a blow. It was not a weather front or a cloud formation. It was a formation of bombers. As they closed the distance, the sheer magnitude of it became clear. Dozens upon dozens of aircraft filled the sky, arranged in precise geometric patterns that moved as one. Tight combat boxes layered upon one another, staggered vertically and laterally until they seemed to merge into a single colossal entity. The sunlight caught on their silver fuselages and wings, scattering shards of brilliance that shimmered across the upper atmosphere. Hartmann had seen aircraft formations before, but nothing like this. It was as if an entire airfield had taken flight. The radio buzzed with clipped chatter, altitude adjustments, fuel checks, attack vectors, but Hartmann could barely hear it over the pounding of his heart. Even from miles away, he could see the contrails streaming from hundreds of engines, the faint puffs of flak bursts already rising from the ground below, and the ominous, unwavering progress of the bomber stream. They were still far from their target, yet they flew with absolute purpose, a mechanical tide moving inexorably toward the Reich. As the squadron began its climb for the attack, the first signs of defensive fire erupted from the mass. Tiny flashes sparkled along the formation's flanks as dozens of machine guns opened up in disciplined bursts. Even at extreme range, the air seemed to ripple with tracers. Hartmann tightened his grip on the control stick and forced himself to a focus. They would have one chance to break into that formation, one chance to strike before the curtain of lead became impassable. The final miles closed quickly. The bombers now loomed enormous in his gun sight, each one a fortress of aluminum and steel, their turrets swiveling like watchful eyes. He could see the details now. The staggered gun positions, the open bomb bay doors, even the tiny dark silhouettes of gunners moving inside the fuselage. It was a sight both magnificent and terrifying. Hartmann had been told in briefings that the Americans would come in strength, that their bombers would fly in disciplined formations and defend themselves ferociously. But no words, no diagrams, no stories told over beer in a pilot's lounge had prepared him for the reality of this moment. The horizon itself seemed to have shifted, transformed from open sky into a living wall of enemy metal. The order came, through the radio, "Attack!" And the formation around him tightened instinctively. Hartmann rolled his Messerschmitt onto its back and dove toward the endless procession of bombers below. The wind screamed past his canopy as he closed, the gap, the defensive fire thickening into a deadly lattice. And as he aimed the nose of his fighter toward the vast, relentless tide of aircraft, a single thought rose, unbidden in his mind. This was not a battle between men and machines. It was a battle between an entire nation's industrial might and those who sought desperately to stop it. The moment Hartmann's Messerschmitt tilted into its attack dive, the sky ceased to feel like open space and became something far more dangerous. A living machine of guns, fire, and steel. The bomber formation that had looked so majestic and distant minutes earlier now loomed ahead like a moving fortress wall. From his altitude, it stretched across the horizon, box upon box of heavy aircraft flying in such tight formation that there seemed to be no gaps between them. And from every direction, top, bottom, tail, and side, the air erupted into streams of tracer fire. It was as if the bombers themselves were alive, bristling and lashing out against anything that dared approach. Hartmann had been briefed on the standard attack procedure: dive in fast from above, fire short bursts at close range, and break away. before the gunners could find their mark. In theory, it was simple. In practice, it was like charging headfirst into a hurricane of bullets. The first streaks of tracer fire appeared hundreds of meters ahead, racing past his canopy in burning arcs. Then the air filled with them, glowing red and orange threads, crisscrossing in every direction, converging and diverging in a deadly lattice. The noise was constant, a dull hammering of distant 50-caliber guns, punctuated by the deeper thud of heavier calibers. Instinct told him to pull away, but discipline held him steady. His target was a B-17 in the center of the lower box, and he knew that hesitation could be fatal. He adjusted his angle slightly, cutting across the formation's defensive fire, and pressed the nose of the aircraft down. The speed built rapidly. 400 kilometers per hour, then 5, and the engines roared as the Messerschmitt hurled itself into the storm. At 200 meters, he squeezed the trigger. The 20mm cannon in his nose barked a short, violent burst, followed by the chatter of the twin machine guns. Sparks leapt from the B-17's fuselage where his shells struck, tearing ragged holes through the aluminum skin. But to his disbelief, the massive bomber did not falter. It kept flying, steady and unwavering, as if the hits had been nothing more than raindrops. He fired again, aiming for the left wing route this time, and was rewarded with a brief puff of smoke. Still, the aircraft held its course. The return fire was relentless. Bullets rattled against his wings and canopy. A burst slammed into his right aileron, jolting the aircraft sideways, and another tore through the tail section, leaving a whining vibration in its wake. Hartmann yanked the stick and rolled away, diving sharply beneath the formation. For a few terrifying seconds, he was directly under the bomber box, the worst possible place to be, and the sky around him became a furnace. Hundreds of rounds tore through the air in chaotic, intersecting patterns. It was not aimed fire, but sheer volume, a wall of lead that filled every inch of the space around the bombers. He leveled out below the formation and banked sharply, pulling into a steep climb to set up a second pass. His breathing was ragged inside the oxygen mask, sweat running down his temples despite the freezing air. He had faced danger before, Soviet fighters diving out of the sun, ground fire erupting from camouflaged positions. But nothing had prepared him for this. This was not a duel. It was not even a battle in the traditional sense. It was an assault on a fortress. The next attack was lower, riskier. Hartmann approached from below and behind, where the bomber's ventral turrets had narrower fields of fire. He slipped into the formation's shadow and came up fast, the silhouette of a B-24 filling his gun sight. Another burst from his cannon, this time striking the left engine nacelle. Flames erupted briefly, and the bomber lurched, dropping a few meters from its position. But even crippled, it did not break apart. It held formation, its 3 remaining engines still dragging it toward Germany's heartland. He broke away again, diving steeply to escape the converging tracers, and for a moment he simply stared at the scene above. It was surreal. Aircraft that should have been falling out of the sky after a few well-placed hits continued flying as if immune to damage. Others, their wings shredded or engines smoking, stayed with the group, supported by the strength of the formation. Each time a bomber fell, another filled the gap. Each time a hole opened in the defensive wall, it closed within seconds. As Hartmann regrouped with his squadron, he realized that their attack had inflicted only superficial damage. A handful of bombers trailed smoke, 1 or 2 had dropped out entirely, but the great mass pressed on, its course unchanged. The factories would still be bombed, the mission would still succeed. It was a sobering realization for a pilot whose life had revolved around precision and individual skill. That day taught him a lesson more profound than any training lecture could. Against Soviet fighters, victory had been a matter of speed, timing, and accuracy, Against the American heavy bombers, it was something else entirely. This was industrial warfare taken to the skies, machines built to absorb punishment, formations designed to survive losses, and a strategy that relied not on a single sortie, but on the unstoppable momentum of thousands of tons of steel and fire. And for the first time in his career, Erich Hartmann felt the uneasy weight of fighting a war that could not be won by talent alone. The first encounter had been a lesson in futility. Charging blindly into the bomber stream had left Hartmann's unit battered and scattered, with little to show for their bravery, but a few smoking engines and a trail of empty ammunition belts. If the Luftwaffe was going to have any hope of stemming the relentless tide of American heavy bombers, its pilots would have to rethink everything they knew about aerial combat. Gone were the days of dogfighting nimble Soviet fighters or swooping on ground targets with near impunity. Against the flying fortresses, brute force and individual skill were not enough. The bomber formations had to be broken, surgically, deliberately, and at great risk. The first tactical shift came from hard-earned experience. Frontal assaults, once considered suicide missions, soon became standard procedure. Intelligence reports and after-action analyses revealed a key vulnerability. The bombers' forward-facing defenses were fewer and less concentrated than the deadly crossfire from their tail guns and waist positions. By approaching from directly ahead, pilots could close the distance quickly and limit their exposure to the heaviest concentrations of fire. But the margin for error was razor-thin. At a combined closing speed of over 800 kilometers per hour, there was barely time to aim, fire, and dive away before a collision became inevitable. Hartmann's first attempt at a head-on attack tested every nerve in his body. He throttled the Bf-109 to maximum power and dove toward the oncoming formation, the bomber silhouette swelling rapidly in his windscreen. The sensation was disorienting. The aircraft appeared motionless at first, then exploded into view in a heartbeat, filling the sky with flashing gunfire. He squeezed the trigger in a 2-second burst, watching tracer rounds streak toward the nose of a B-17 before rolling violently to one side, the bombers flashing past him so close he could see the faces of their gunners. It was over in seconds. But when he looked back, one bomber was dropping out of formation, smoke trailing from its cockpit. The tactic worked, but only if a pilot had the steel to attempt it again and again under impossible conditions. Vertical diving attacks became another essential tactic. Rather than meeting the bombers head-on or from the rear, some pilots climbed to altitudes well above the formation and then dove almost vertically through it, using gravity to increase their speed and reduce exposure to defensive fire. Hartmann's squadron practiced this relentlessly, learning to coordinate their timing so that wave after wave of fighters would streak through the bomber boxes like falling arrows. The technique demanded precision and iron discipline. A moment's hesitation could send a pilot crashing through the formation or into the path of a fellow attacker. Yet when executed correctly, it sowed chaos among the bombers, forcing them to break formation and exposing isolated aircraft to follow-up attacks. Coordination, too, became a matter of survival. Gone were the days when individual aces could dominate a battle with skill alone. Now entire Gruppen worked together, staging layered attacks designed to overwhelm the bombers' defenses. One wave might perform head-on passes while another attacked, from above or below, dividing the gunner's attention and creating openings for more decisive strikes. Hartmann often flew as part of a rotor, a two-plane element, weaving in and out of the formation in carefully choreographed movements. Every maneuver was planned in advance, every second of exposure calculated. Even with these new tactics, the price was staggering. Losses mounted with every mission. Experienced pilots were shot down in flames. Rookies vanished into the swirling chaos of gunfire and contrails before they even reached their targets. The attrition rate was so high that some squadrons were losing a third of their aircraft in a single engagement. Each successful pass cost blood, steel, and men Germany could no longer easily replace. For Hartmann, the experience was humbling. He had entered the war believing that superior skill could decide the outcome of any engagement. Against the bomber streams, he learned that even perfect execution could end with your cockpit filling with smoke and your canopy riddled with holes. The enemy had engineered a system designed to survive, and it was working. Every new tactic the Luftwaffe devised forced the Americans to adapt, reinforcing weak points and tightening their formations. And still, the bombers came, day after day, in numbers that seemed to grow with every sortie. By late 1943, Hartmann's squadron had become a finely tuned instrument of interception, capable of launching coordinated assaults that tore gaps in the bomber streams and brought down aircraft in flames. But the victories were increasingly hollow. For every fortress they destroyed, 3 more took its place. The factories continued to churn, the raids grew larger, and the sky over Germany darkened once more with the relentless hum of engines. Breaking the box had become possible, but stopping the tide remained beyond their reach. And deep down, Hartmann knew that each mission brought them closer, not to triumph, but to exhaustion. The first time Hartmann watched a heavy bomber fall from the sky, it was nothing like the triumph he had imagined. He had attacked from below, climbing sharply into the belly of the formation, aiming for the vulnerable engine cluster, just as the instructors had drilled into them. His 20-millimeter cannon rounds struck home, bright orange flashes tearing through the left wing of a B-17, flames trailing behind it like a wounded comet. At first, the aircraft held its place, stubborn and steady, as though refusing to admit defeat. Then slowly, it began to slip backward, losing altitude and falling away from the formation's protective box. Hartmann rolled his Messerschmitt to follow. He expected to feel a surge of satisfaction, the kind that came from outmaneuvering a Soviet fighter or breaking up an Il-2 attack run. But instead, as he closed the distance, he found himself staring into a scene he had never truly considered. The great bomber was mortally wounded, but not lifeless. Its remaining engines still turned, its gunners still fired, and then, one by one, white blossoms began to open against the blue sky. Parachutes. They emerged from the broken fuselage, like seeds released from a dying tree, each one carrying a man who only moments before had been trying to kill him. The sight unsettled him more than he expected. These were not faceless enemies, not abstract threats to the Reich's factories or cities. They were men, young and frightened, tumbling through the same cold air he breathed. Through his canopy, he could see one parachutist clutching something, a small bag or perhaps a photograph, as he drifted downward. Another twisted helplessly in the slipstream, struggling to control his chute as the wind dragged him toward the distant countryside below. Hartmann felt an involuntary pang of something that was neither pity nor guilt, but a deep, unfamiliar awareness. He had grown accustomed to thinking of his opponents as machines. Soviet fighters were simply targets, small, fast-moving shapes that burst into fire and smoke when hit. He rarely saw their pilots bail out. More often they crashed into forests or fields, disappearing from sight before he could even register their humanity. But here, with these American bomber crews, there was no denying the human cost. 10 men had flown that B-17, and now they were scattered across the sky. Mechanics, radio operators, gunners, perhaps a boy no older than himself manning the tail gun. They were soldiers, yes, but they were also people, fighting not out of hatred, but because duty demanded it. The more missions he flew against the bomber streams, the more this feeling returned. He began to notice small details he had ignored before. A waist gunner still firing from a burning fuselage, a crewman helping another out of a hatch as flames licked at the wings, parachutes opening even as the wreckage spun toward the ground. Once, after a particularly fierce engagement, Hartmann watched an entire bomber disintegrate in mid-air, its nose section breaking free and spinning like a toy. Even then, even in that chaotic moment, 2 parachutes blossomed from the debris. It was as if the crews refused to surrender to the inevitability of death, clinging desperately to life even as their aircraft crumbled around them. He began to think differently about the machines themselves too. The B-17s and B-24s were more than just metal targets. They were lifelines, flying homes for their crews. Inside their cavernous fuselages were cramped, freezing compartments where men worked shoulder to shoulder, passing ammunition belts and calling out enemy positions. Their bomb bays held not just explosives, but the industrial power of a continent, thousands of miles away. And yet, despite their size and strength, they were fragile when stripped of their engines and crews, just twisted steel falling to earth. Hartmann did not become sentimental. He was still a fighter pilot, sworn to bring those bombers down before they could rain destruction on his homeland. But something had shifted. Each parachute that drifted toward the fields below reminded him that the war was larger than himself, larger than any single kill or sortie. It was fought by men who, like him, were trapped inside the machinery of nations, carrying out missions they had not chosen but could not refuse. Later, when he landed and climbed from the cockpit, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline, he found himself wondering where those men were now. Were they captured and on their way to a prison camp? Had they survived the landing? Did they curse his name as they trudged through unfamiliar soil, or were they relieved simply to be alive? The questions lingered long after the smoke cleared, and with them came an understanding that unsettled him deeply. That victory in the air was not measured only in aircraft destroyed or missions thwarted. It was measured, too, in the lives scattered across the sky, lives that looked more and more like his own. The longer Hartmann fought against the bomber streams, the more he came to understand that they were not simply weapons. They were symbols. Each one he saw lumbering over the Reich was more than a machine. It was a manifestation of a vast and relentless industrial apparatus, one so immense that even as the Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the skies, the tide only grew heavier. At first, he had measured the bombers in tactical terms: altitude, speed, defensive range, bomb load. But with every mission, those metrics seemed less relevant. What mattered was not the individual aircraft, but what they represented. A nation that could build thousands more without blinking. The evidence was everywhere. A bomber he helped destroy on Tuesday would be replaced by another by the time he flew again on Thursday. Entire formations he had helped tear apart the previous week would reappear twice as large days later. It was as though the Americans were drawing from an inexhaustible well, one that German factories could not hope to match. At the debriefings, intelligence officers spoke in tones that bordered on disbelief. The United States, they said, was producing hundreds of B-17s and B-24s every month, an output so vast that the loss of a dozen or more on a single raid barely registered. In the span of a single year, American factories could replace the entire bomber fleet several times over. Hartmann began to view the bombers not as airplanes, but as airborne factories themselves, flying products of an assembly line that stretched across a continent. Each one was a miracle of logistics and industry, engines forged in one state, wings riveted together in another, machine guns shipped from yet another plant hundreds of miles away. By the time the finished aircraft rolled out of a hangar in Seattle or Fort Worth, it had been touched by tens of thousands of hands. The men who flew them were just the final link in a chain of production that dwarfed anything Germany could dream of. That reality weighed heavily on him during sorties. Each attack, no matter how skillful or deadly, felt like striking at the shadow of something much larger. Destroying a bomber did not diminish the force behind it. It was like shooting at the branches of a tree while its roots grew deeper and wider beneath the soil. Even as the Luftwaffe scrambled every fighter it could muster, the streams kept coming, bigger, heavier, more frequent, and every time they came, they flew with the confidence of a nation that knew it could afford the losses. It wasn't just the numbers. The bombers themselves bore the marks of industrial strength. Their design prioritized production speed and interchangeability. Damaged parts could be swapped out in hours. Engines and weapons were standardized across models. Crews rotated between aircraft with minimal training because the systems were nearly identical. The sheer efficiency of it was staggering. Hartmann had once toured a German aircraft plant and watched skilled craftsmen shape parts by hand, each step requiring precision and time. The Americans had turned the process into something entirely different, an automated rhythm, a relentless pulse that spat out aircraft by the hundreds. One afternoon, after a particularly brutal engagement that saw dozens of fighters lost and only a handful of bombers destroyed, Hartmann stood by the edge of the airfield, watching the smoke trails fade from the horizon. He tried to calculate the impact of their efforts. 20 bombers downed, perhaps. Maybe 30, but how many would arrive next week? 50, 100, more? The answer gnawed at him. The Luftwaffe was fighting a battle of attrition it could never win because Germany was not fighting just against men or machines. It was fighting against a nation's industrial soul. Even the psychological effect was profound. German civilians had once believed that every bomber shot down was a significant victory. Every raid disrupted a crippling blow to the Allied war machine. But as the raids grew in size and frequency, that illusion vanished. The bombers came regardless of how many were destroyed. The cities burned regardless of how bravely the fighters fought, and still the assembly lines in Detroit and Seattle hummed, still the trains carried engines and aluminum and fuel, still the skies filled again with the thunder of thousands of engines. For Hartmann, the realization marked a turning point. He was no longer merely a fighter pilot. He was a man standing against a tide of steel and production that no amount of courage could turn back. The bombers had become something far greater than targets. They were proof of what total war looked like when fought by a nation with limitless resources. And as he climbed back into his cockpit for another sortie, he knew that every engagement, no matter how ferocious, was just a skirmish in a much larger struggle. One fought as much in factories and shipyards as it was in the skies over Germany. By the autumn of 1943, the skies above Germany had begun to feel heavier, not just with aircraft, but with inevitability. Hartmann and his squadron were flying more sorties than ever before, scrambling 2 or 3 times a day to meet the waves of bombers that came rolling in from across the Channel. Yet no matter how many they destroyed, no matter how many formations they managed to scatter or disrupt, it changed nothing. Within days, sometimes hours, another raid would come, and then another, and another. The tempo was relentless, and with each new wave, the pilots of the Luftwaffe felt their morale erode a little more. At first, there had been confidence, even pride, in their ability to inflict losses. A raid might cost the Americans 15, 20, even 30 bombers. Dozens of parachutes would dot the sky as crippled aircraft fell from their formations. Yet the following week, a force twice as large would appear, flying the same route, at the same altitude, with the same mechanical precision. It was as if their enemies had an endless supply of men and machines. Word filtered back from intelligence officers that this was not far from the truth. The Americans, they said, were producing bombers faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. More than 700 a month, sometimes more. It was a figure so staggering that many pilots refused to believe it. But the evidence was there, roaring over their heads. The psychological toll of this imbalance was profound. Hartmann began to notice it in the small, unspoken changes around the airfield. The laughter and teasing that had once filled the ready rooms grew quieter. Briefings that once brimmed with confidence turned into solemn strategy sessions focused on minimizing losses rather than achieving victories. Even the ground crews seemed subdued, their faces etched with exhaustion as they patched bullet holes and replaced shattered canopies on aircraft that would be sent back into the sky within hours. There was a grim rhythm to the work now. Scramble, climb, attack, watch the sky fill with fire, return home, if they were lucky, and prepare to do it all again tomorrow. The sense of progress, of shaping the course of the war through skill and courage, had evaporated. They were no longer defending the Reich's airspace so much as buying time, delaying the inevitable while the enemy's industrial might ground inexorably forward. Hartmann himself felt the weight of that realization most keenly when he studied the bombers he was ordered to destroy. Each one that fell seemed almost insignificant, its wreckage a speck of debris against the enormity of the Allied air offensive. It was not that the Luftwaffe lacked courage or skill. His comrades flew with both in abundance, but that those qualities meant less and less against a machine of such scale. The Americans could lose 100 bombers in a single day and launch another 1,000 the following week. Germany, by contrast, struggled to replace even a handful of fighters or to train new pilots fast enough to replace those who were lost. The imbalance was everywhere, not just in the sky, but on the ground. Fuel was increasingly scarce. Replacement parts took longer to arrive. Pilots were being rushed through training with fewer flight hours. Their first combat sorties often their last. Even ammunition was rationed, and some squadrons were told to limit their time in combat. Hartmann watched friends, men with whom he had shared barracks and laughter, vanish in streaks of flame and smoke, replaced by fresh-faced replacements who barely knew how to keep formation. The Luftwaffe was bleeding, and there was no transfusion strong enough to keep it alive. What struck him most was how different the two sides' wars had become. For Germany, every aircraft lost was a blow, every experienced pilot killed a wound that might never heal. For the United States, losses were a statistic, regrettable but tolerable, absorbed by an industrial system that could build replacements before the wreckage had cooled. Each bomber that flew over Germany carried not just bombs, but the weight of thousands of workers, factories, railroads, and ships behind it. They were the visible edge of a war machine that Germany, even at its peak, could never hope to match. By winter, the mood in Hartmann's unit had hardened into grim resignation. They would keep fighting because there was nothing else to do. They would keep climbing into the cold blue sky and throwing themselves against the metal tide. But in the quiet moments between sorties, Hartmann found himself wondering whether courage still mattered in a war like this. Skill and valor could win battles. They had done so again and again. But wars, he was beginning to understand, were not won in cockpits. They were won in the endless sprawl of factories and shipyards, in the humming of assembly lines and the turning of gears. And in that war, Germany was already losing. By the spring of 1944, the air war over Germany had entered a new and far more dangerous phase. The bomber streams that had once lumbered across the sky, largely unescorted, were no longer vulnerable during their long journeys to and from their targets. Now they came with sharp, fast company, fighters that darted like wolves around the herd, ready to tear into any Luftwaffe formation that approached. The Americans had solved the problem that had once been their greatest weakness: range. And with that solution came the P-47 Thunderbolt and, more ominously, the P-51 Mustang, aircraft that would change the very nature of the conflict. Hartmann's first encounter with the new escorts came during what should have been a routine interception. His squadron had been vectored toward a formation of bombers over Saxony, their plan simple and practiced: climb above, dive through, and scatter the defensive fire. But as they approached, the bomber formation shifted, not in panic, but in preparation. Out of the haze above and behind them, tiny shapes began to materialize, dropping toward the German fighters at frightening speed. Within moments, the sky erupted into chaos. The P-47s hit first, their radial engines roaring, their 8 heavy machine guns spitting streams of fire. They were not nimble, but they were powerful and almost indestructible, shrugging off hits that would have shredded a Bf-109. Hartmann found himself forced into a defensive turn almost immediately, abandoning his attack vector and diving away from the bomber stream just to survive. The Americans didn't chase far. They didn't have to. Their job wasn't to hunt German fighters down, but to drive them off, to keep them from getting anywhere near the bombers. And they did it well. A few weeks later came the real shock, the P-51 Mustang. Sleek, fast, and agile, it was unlike anything Hartmann had faced before. With its long-range tanks, it could follow the bombers deep into Germany and still fight at altitude. Worse, it could match or exceed the Messerschmitt's performance in almost every category. Where the Thunderbolt had relied on brute force, the Mustang relied on finesse. It could dive with the Germans, climb with them, and turn inside them. Suddenly, the hunters became the hunted. For the Luftwaffe, the effect was devastating. Every tactic they had developed against the bomber formations had to be reconsidered. Coordinated dives and head-on attacks were nearly impossible when fighter screens were waiting above the formation. Approaching from below invited ambush. Even the long-practiced tactic of striking the bombers as they turned for home, when escorts had once been forced to turn back, was no longer viable. The P-51 stayed with the bombers all the way back to the Channel, harrying German fighters until fuel gauges dropped dangerously low. Hartmann learned to adapt because there was no other choice. The squadron began flying in looser formations, using altitude advantage and the sun to mask their approach. Surprise became their only real weapon. A successful interception now depended as much on deception as on skill. They had to draw the escorts away from the bombers with feints and sudden dives, forcing them into dogfights that sapped their numbers and attention. Only then could another wave attempt to strike on the bombers themselves. Even so, losses mounted. The psychological effect was even more crushing than the physical one. Once, German pilots had believed they could dictate the terms of the fight. Now, they were constantly reacting, forced to play the Americans' game on American terms. The enemy owned the initiative. It was one thing to fight a formation of bombers, slow, predictable, and vulnerable to clever tactics. It was another to fight those bombers with an entire squadron of elite fighters circling above them, ready to tear into any attacker with speed and precision. Hartmann could feel the change in the air around the squadron. Missions were no longer about victory. They were about survival. Even the most experienced aces approached the bomber streams with a mixture of dread and resignation. Many simply didn't return. The attrition rate, already high, soared even further. It became common for an entire staffel to engage a formation and come back with only half its pilots. Some never came back at all. In quiet moments after sorties, Hartmann would sit on the edge of the airfield and watch the fuel trucks move across the tarmac, the mechanics crawling over the battered remnants of his squadron's aircraft. He would think of the Americans, thousands of kilometers away, producing not just bombers by the hundreds, but fighters to match them, pilots to fly them, and fuel to keep them in the sky. The Luftwaffe was still fighting bravely, still flying every mission it could. But deep down, Hartmann knew the truth. The air war was no longer about daring or skill. It was about who could sustain the fight. And in that fight, Germany was being outproduced, outmaneuvered, and slowly, inexorably overwhelmed. By the time Erich Hartmann's victories began to number in the hundreds, the act of shooting down an enemy aircraft had lost much of its thrill. The adrenaline still surged, the focus still sharpened, but the sense of triumph that had once followed. Each kill was replaced by something far more complex. He had seen too much. Too many men fall through burning skies, too many machines spiral into the earth, to mistake the war for a simple contest of skill. What impressed him now was not his own ability to bring them down, but the sheer willpower of the men who kept coming, mission after mission, knowing full well how many would never return. It was the bomber crews who haunted him most. He had learned to predict their behavior, to anticipate how they would tighten their formation when threatened, how they would maintain their steady course even as their comrades fell beside them. But what he could never fully comprehend was their resolve. They flew into the teeth of German air defenses with a determination that bordered on madness, over flak-riddled cities, through walls of fire, and into skies patrolled by some of the deadliest fighter pilots in the world. Even after seeing formations shredded, aircraft burning, and friends bailing out into hostile territory, they came back the next day and did it all again. Hartmann had once dismissed such persistence as mechanical obedience, soldiers simply following orders, but the more he saw of them, the less that explanation sufficed. These were men who knew statistically that their chances of surviving a full tour were slim. They had seen bombers explode in mid-air, watched others disintegrate under concentrated cannon fire, and witnessed parachutes blossom across the sky, like ghostly flowers marking the graves of friends. Yet still they climbed into their aircraft, adjusted their flight gear, and flew into Germany's heartland with unwavering discipline. That, Hartmann realized, required a kind of courage entirely different from his own. As a fighter pilot, his fate was in his own hands. He could use his speed and skill to escape a bad situation, could disengage from a hopeless fight, could choose when and where to strike. Bomber crews had no such luxury. They flew straight and level into the inferno, locked into formations that offered mutual protection, but also made them predictable targets. They endured the relentless pounding of flak without the option to turn away. They watched enemy fighters dive directly at them, knowing that the only thing standing between survival and death were the machine guns bolted to their turrets and the hope that the formation would hold together. There were moments when Hartmann found himself hesitating before pulling the trigger. It wasn't pity. He was still a soldier, and his duty was to bring those bombers down before they could level German cities. But there was a growing weight in the act, an awareness that each trigger pull was aimed not at a faceless enemy, but at 10 men strapped inside a flying fortress, each with his own story, his own fears, his own desperate hope of seeing home again. The more he flew, the more he saw of their world. Once, after shooting down a B-24 that broke apart in the sky, he circled above the parachutes, drifting toward a patchwork of farmland below. He watched one man wave weakly to another as they descended, and for reasons he could not explain, the image stayed with him for days. Another time, after a particularly brutal raid, he landed and walked out to where a captured bomber crew was being escorted from a crashed aircraft. Their faces were pale and streaked with soot, their uniforms torn, yet their bearing was proud. One man, his arm bandaged and blood seeping through the cloth, saluted a fallen comrade being carried past on a stretcher. In that moment, Hartmann saw not enemies, but fellow airmen, men who had risked everything for their duty, just as he had. That respect extended even to their machines. The bombers were not just targets anymore. They were symbols of endurance, embodiments of the industrial might and collective will of an entire nation. They kept flying no matter how many were lost, because behind them stood thousands of workers and engineers, millions of civilians, and a nation determined to bring the war to Germany's doorstep. By 1944, Hartmann was Germany's most successful fighter pilot, a name whispered with awe and dread on both sides of the front. Yet the more his legend grew, the more humble he felt in the face of the men he fought against. Skill could bring down an aircraft, tactics could scatter a formation, but courage, the raw, unyielding courage he saw in the faces of those bomber crews could not be destroyed with cannon shells. It was something beyond weapons, beyond strategy, and it was the one thing above all that Hartmann had come to respect. The morning of the Regensburg raid dawned with an unsettling stillness, the kind of silence that seemed to know it would soon be shattered. Hartmann and his comrades stood beside their fighters as the sun lifted over the airfield, pale and thin, behind a haze of industrial smoke, waiting for the inevitable call. It came just after dawn. Reconnaissance had confirmed a massive formation of American bombers crossing the Channel and pushing deep into German airspace. The target, they were told, was Regensburg, a vital center of aircraft production, and the scale of the raid was unprecedented. Hundreds of B-17s were already inbound, and they would arrive with full escort. As Hartmann climbed into the sky with his squadron, the radio crackled with reports from other sectors. Contact had been made over France. Interceptions had begun. Over the Rhine. Still, the stream pressed forward, swelling as formations linked up into a single colossal mass. By the time Hartmann's Gruppe approached intercept altitude, the horizon was alive with silver. They were not clouds, not contrails. They were bombers, hundreds of them, gleaming in the morning light like a steel tide, stretching as far as he could see. The first sign of battle came long before they reached firing range. Anti-aircraft. Guns from the ground below opened up, their black puffs blooming across the sky in thick, sinister clusters. The bombers flew directly into the storm, their formations tightening but never breaking. Hartmann watched, almost disbelieving, as aircraft disappeared into clouds of shrapnel bursts only to emerge again, wings still level, engines still roaring. Some streamed smoke, some trailed pieces of aluminum skin fluttering into the wind, but the formation held. The Americans were not turning back. When the fighters dove in, the sky erupted into chaos. Tracers cut through the air in every direction. Hartmann aimed his Messerschmitt at the lead elements of the formation, diving headlong through the storm of defensive fire. The air trembled with the combined roar of hundreds of engines. All around him, fighters spiraled into position, cannon, fire flashing from their noses. A B-17 exploded ahead of him, a sudden orange bloom that tore the aircraft apart mid-air. Yet even as the debris scattered, the bombers behind it closed ranks, filling the gap as if the destroyed plane had never existed. The intensity of the battle defied comprehension. Everywhere Hartmann looked, the sky was alive. Streaks of fire, parachutes drifting, bombers trailing smoke, and fighters carving desperate turns through the maelstrom. He fired into the belly of one bomber and saw its wing erupt in flames, but before he could watch it fall, another was already in his gun sight. It was endless, like trying to empty a river with a bucket. Then came the moment that would sear itself into his memory, even as the German fighters inflicted terrible losses, even as anti-aircraft bursts peppered the formations, the bombers did not waver. At the precise moment, their bomb bay doors opened in unison. Hartmann glanced down and saw Regensburg spread out below, the sprawling Messerschmitt factory complex, rail yards, fuel depots. And then the bombs began to fall. Dozens, then hundreds, dark specks against the pale morning sky. The earth below erupted in fire and dust, massive plumes rising like volcanic ash. Through the smoke and explosions, the bombers flew on, their mission unchanged, their resolve unbroken. By the time the engagement ended, the Luftwaffe had claimed dozens of kills. The sky was littered with the remnants of the battle, burning, wreckage falling in spirals, parachutes drifting silently, and trails of black smoke marking where aircraft had gone down. But when Hartmann looked up again, the survivors were still there, still flying toward home in disciplined formation. Regensburg lay below them in flames, its factories crippled, its production lines shattered. The cost to the Americans had been horrific. Nearly a quarter of the attacking bombers had been shot down, and many more would never fly again, yet the mission had succeeded. The target was hit, the damage done, and the message delivered. The United States could project power deep into the heart of Germany, and would do so again. Hartmann landed that afternoon with his nerves frayed and his aircraft riddled with holes. He was exhausted, but more than that, he was shaken. He had seen courage before, in Soviet pilots, in German tank crews, in the infantry holding the line, but nothing like this. The American bomber crews had flown straight into the firestorm and pressed on, absorbing losses that would have broken most armies, sacrificing aircraft and lives to complete their mission. For the first time, he felt something close to doubt. If the enemy could do this, if they could lose so much and still come back again, then perhaps the Luftwaffe's victories were illusions. Perhaps Germany was not stopping the tide at all. It was merely slowing it momentarily as the full weight of American industry and determination gathered beyond the horizon, ready to come again, and they would come again. Of that, Hartmann was certain. By late 1944, the illusion of control that had once sustained the Luftwaffe was beginning to crack apart. The confident, disciplined force that had once dominated Europe's skies now felt stretched thin, exhausted, and bleeding from 1,000 cuts. Hartmann could see it everywhere, in the empty hangars, in the faces of young pilots barely out of training school, in the growing silence that followed every mission briefing. The Luftwaffe was still fighting, but it was no longer the same air force that had swept across the continent in 1939. It was a wounded giant, struggling to stay upright as the weight of Allied power pressed harder with each passing month. Fuel shortages were the first and most visible sign of the crisis. By the autumn of 1944, the Allied bombing campaign had crippled Germany's oil refineries and transportation networks. Aviation fuel was rationed so severely that training flights were cut to a fraction of what they had once been. Hartmann remembered the days when he could practice combat maneuvers for hours, honing every reflex until the aircraft felt like an extension of his body. Now the new recruits he flew alongside were lucky to get a few dozen hours in the cockpit before being sent into combat. Some had never fired their weapons outside of a training range. Others had never flown above 5,000 meters. They were being asked to face the most formidable air armada in history with the skills of beginners. The results were devastating. Entire squadrons were wiped out in their first engagements. Replacement pilots, eager but inexperienced, often fell victim to enemy fighters before they even reached the bomber formations. Hartmann tried to mentor them, teaching them the subtle tricks that had kept him alive: when to dive, how to break formation, how to use the sun as cover. But there was only so much he could do. Experience could not be taught in a briefing room, and time was the one resource Germany no longer had. Aircraft production, too, was faltering. Allied raids targeted factories relentlessly, and though the Reich scrambled to move assembly lines underground or scatter them across smaller workshops, output plummeted. Many of the fighters that did roll off the line were rushed into service with mechanical issues that would have grounded them earlier in the war. Spare parts were scarce, ammunition was rationed, and ground crews worked around the clock just to keep the remaining aircraft flying. Hartmann's Bf-109, once pristine and meticulously maintained, now bore the scars of repeated patchwork repairs, mismatched panels, leaking hydraulics, and an engine that coughed ominously on cold mornings. Yet even as the Luftwaffe's strength diminished, the enemy's grew. The bomber formations were larger than ever, their ranks swelling with wave after wave of new aircraft. The escorts that once arrived late or departed early now swarmed the skies from the moment the formations crossed into German airspace until the last bomb fell. The sleek P-51 Mustangs and rugged P-47 Thunderbolts prowled above and below the bomber streams, making any approach a deadly gamble. Where once a German fighter might pick off a straggler and slip away, now it faced the near certainty of a counterattack. The disparity was impossible to ignore. Hartmann's unit would scramble a dozen fighters to meet a raid and find themselves outnumbered 10-1. Even when they inflicted heavy losses, dozens of bombers destroyed, escorts scattered, the impact was fleeting. Days later, the formations returned, larger and more heavily armed. It was as though the Allied war machine was not merely replenishing its losses, but multiplying them. Every engagement felt like trying to hold back the tide with bare hands. The morale of the Luftwaffe crumbled under the weight of that reality. The swagger and confidence that had once defined its fighter pilots gave way to quiet resignation. Mission briefings no longer promised victory. They spoke, instead of buying time, of delaying the inevitable destruction of Germany's cities and factories. Pilots stopped counting kills and started counting sorties survived. The younger ones still clung to bravado, boasting of the enemy they would shoot down, but the veterans, men like Hartmann, knew the truth. This was not a fight they could win, and yet they kept flying. Hartmann still climbed into the cockpit before dawn, still hunted the bomber formations with every ounce of skill and instinct he possessed. But now each mission felt less like a battle and more like a statement, a refusal to surrender, even as the foundations beneath them crumbled. He understood that the Reich's air force was dying, its strength bleeding away with every lost pilot and every burned-out engine. And still, as the sky filled with contrails and the horizon thundered with the approach of another wave, he throttled forward and rose to meet them, because that was all that was left to do. The raid had ended hours ago, but the sound of it still echoed in Hartmann's ears. Even now, as he sat on an overturned crate near the edge of the airfield, he could hear the phantom thrum of hundreds of engines reverberating somewhere beyond the horizon. The hangars behind him were quiet, except for the clatter of tools and the low murmur of mechanics working under floodlights, patching holes and replacing shot-out panels. The squadron had returned battered but alive, fewer aircraft than had taken off, more empty bunks in the barracks. But they had done their duty. Another wave of bombers had been met, another formation scattered, another mission completed. And yet, as Hartmann stared at the darkening sky, he could not shake the sense that none of it mattered. He had seen the enemy today, not just their aircraft, but the scale of them. The formation had seemed endless, a rolling machine of steel and will that filled the heavens from one edge of the horizon to the other. They had attacked it with everything they had, head-on passes, coordinated dives, concentrated cannon fire. Dozens of bombers fell, black plumes marking where they had broken apart or vanished into the clouds. And yet the formation did not shrink. It tightened, shifted, and closed its ranks, continuing forward as though nothing had happened. The bombs still fell, the factories still burned, the cities still trembled beneath the weight of their destruction. When the last contrails faded and the last fires burned low on the horizon, Hartmann walked back to the hangar in silence. It was there, among the fuel drums and spent shell casings, that he found Heinrich, one of the few veterans left from the early days of the war. The older pilot was sitting on the wing of his aircraft, helmet still in his lap, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. For a long while neither of them spoke. They had shared too many missions, too many funerals, to need words. But tonight the silence felt heavier than usual, as if both men were holding back a truth they no longer had the strength to ignore. It was Hartmann who finally broke it. "We can shoot down 50, he said quietly. "Maybe 100, and still they come." Heinrich didn't look at him. "They'll always come," he replied, "because they're not sending planes anymore, they're sending factories." The words hung between them, blunt and undeniable. It was something Hartmann had felt for months, but had never said aloud. The bombers overhead were no longer just aircraft to him. They were the physical embodiment of a nation's industrial heart, beating miles away across an ocean. Every B-17 he saw in the sky represented thousands of workers on an assembly line. Thousands more mining ore, refining fuel, shipping parts, building engines. Every bomber they shot down had already been replaced before it even reached German airspace. They weren't fighting machines anymore. They were fighting a system. Hartmann leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, and stared at the streaked concrete beneath his boots. "We're trying to win this war in the sky," he said. "But the war isn't happening here. It's happening in factories in Detroit and Chicago and Seattle, and there's nothing we can do about that." Heinrich let out a breath that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "We can't shoot down an assembly line," he said. "We can't strafe a steel mill or dogfight a shipyard. All we can do is keep flying and hope it matters." That was the heart of the matter, Hartmann realized. All the courage in the world, all the skill, all the tactical brilliance, none of it could destroy the foundries that poured molten metal into bomber frames, or the railroads that carried them to the coast, or the ships that ferried them across the Atlantic. They were fighting the tip of a spear whose shaft was too vast to reach. The realization was both humbling and horrifying. It stripped away the romantic illusions that had drawn him into the Luftwaffe in the first place. He had grown up believing in the myth of the ace, the lone pilot who could change the course of a battle through sheer talent and willpower. But this war was not about aces. It was about coal and steel and oil and manpower. It was about who could build more, faster and longer. And on that front, Germany had already lost. The wind picked up across the airfield, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke from the burning industrial district beyond the hills. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and then went silent. Hartmann stood and looked up at the empty sky, his breath clouding in the cold. Tomorrow the bombers would come again. More of them, larger formations, tighter escorts. They would fall, and more would replace them. And still he would climb into his fighter, still he would fight, because that was all there was left to do. But for the first time, he understood the truth he had been avoiding. This war would not be won or lost in the clouds. It was already being decided far below, on factory floors and assembly lines he would never see. When the war finally ended, Erich Hartmann found himself walking across an airfield, not as a hunter, but as a survivor. The silence that hung over the ruined landscape felt alien, too deep, too still, after years spent with the constant roar of engines above his head. The war that had consumed his youth and defined his life was over, and Germany lay broken beneath the weight of defeat. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, was a shattered remnant. And as he looked out across the empty sky, he found his thoughts drifting back to the first time he had seen an American bomber formation filling the horizon, a memory that had lost none of its clarity with the passing of years. He could still recall the disbelief he'd felt that day, watching what he had first mistaken for a cloud resolve into a disciplined column of B-17s and B-24s. It had been his introduction to a new kind of warfare, one that was not defined by speed or maneuverability, but by scale and endurance. The IM bombers were unlike anything he had ever fought, flying fortresses in the truest sense, each one carrying not just a crew and a payload, but the weight of a nation's industrial might. They had defied his expectations, survived damage that would have destroyed any Soviet aircraft, and pressed on through flak and cannon fire with a determination that seemed almost mechanical. In the years that followed, Hartmann had faced those bombers again and again. He had learned their strengths and weaknesses, refined tactics to exploit their vulnerabilities, and watched countless formations shatter under concentrated attack. He had shot them down by the dozens. Yet the one lesson that remained constant, the one that haunted every sortie and every victory, was that none of it ever seemed to matter. Every aircraft that fell was replaced, every gap torn into a Formation was filled. The bombing raids grew larger, not smaller, as the war dragged on. It was a lesson written across the sky in contrails and smoke. Bravery and skill could win battles, but they could not win wars fought on the scale that the Allies had mastered. Hartmann spoke often with other surviving aces in the years after 1945, and they all confessed to the same realization. None doubted the courage or talent of the Luftwaffe's pilots. They had fought with ferocity and often against overwhelming odds. But no amount of individual heroism could compensate for the fact that Germany had been fighting nations that measured, their strength not in squadrons but in factories, shipyards and assembly lines. The Americans could build planes faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down, train pilots faster than Germany could replace its losses, and supply entire armies. Overseas, while German divisions struggled to fuel a single offensive. The war had not been lost in the clouds, but in the warehouses and production floors far beyond their reach. For Hartmann, the lesson extended beyond warfare. The bombers had shown him something fundamental about the modern world, that power was no longer a matter of individual strength or even tactical brilliance. It was a matter of systems, of logistics, manufacturing, and coordination. A single bomber was formidable. 1,000 of them, supported by an economy that could produce 1,000 more, were unstoppable. And in that reality lay the future of all conflicts. He often thought back to the men inside those bombers, the gunners who never stopped firing even as their aircraft burned, the pilots who held their formation steady as flak tore holes through, their wings, the crews who flew mission after mission, knowing how slim their chances of survival were. He had respected them then, and he respected them even more with the distance of time. They had taught him that courage took many forms. It was in the daring of a lone fighter pilot diving into a wall of fire, but it was also in the quiet resolve of a bomber crew flying straight into the heart of enemy territory with no promise of return. Standing on that empty airfield after the war, Hartmann realized that those men, and the machines they flew, had changed the way he understood conflict. They had stripped away the myths of invincibility and heroism that had defined the early days of the Luftwaffe and replaced them with a harsher, more enduring truth. Wars were not decided by the few, no matter how skilled or fearless. They were decided by the many, by the workers in the factories, the engineers designing supply chains, the farmers growing the food that kept armies moving. The B-17s and B-24s had taught him that lesson in the most brutal way imaginable. They had shown him that even the greatest ace could not shoot down a production line, and that the courage of a nation, harnessed through industry and organization, could overcome even the fiercest resistance. And as he watched the sky remain empty, the silence broken only by the wind sweeping across the abandoned runway, he understood why Germany had lost, and why those great silver bombers, more than any weapon or general, had been the true architects of victory.